Good morning, everyone. My name is Michèle Flournoy. I'm the CEO of the Center for a New American Security, and I'm very pleased to welcome you this morning to this session on national security and U.S. crude oil export. This event coincides with the release of a new CNAS report. We hope you'll pick up a copy outside while you're here. You can download it from our website. This comes at a really important time. As you all know, the unconventional energy revolution in the United States over the last several years has brought about a new era of energy abundance for this country. Crude oil production has increased significantly from 5 million barrels per day in 2008 to over 9 million, excuse me, I wanted to say billion, but it's really million per day. In 2013, the United States surpassed Saudi Arabia to become the largest producer of liquid fuels in the world. Remarkably, after a decade of concerns about scarcity of our energy supplies, the nation has seen a reversal of heavy and growing energy import reliance to become a major exporter of refined petroleum products, a powerhouse in the production of energy-intensive petrochemicals, and in industrial manufacturing. And as you know, we're on the verge of becoming an exporter of liquefied natural gas. The United States, however, is not an exporter or a major exporter of crude oil. And this is not for lack of potential or available supplies. Rather, it is due to laws that are on the books that were established in the 1970s in response to the OPEC oil embargo. So given the changing energy situation, the revolution that we've been experiencing, now is the time to reinvigorate the debate over current restrictions on U.S. export of crude oil. And we're here today in particular to discuss not only the economic implications and the environmental implications, which have been talked about quite widely, but really to go into the national security implications of this policy debate. There are a variety of ways in which abundant domestic energy and free trade in oil would be significant to our security. The ability to freely export crude oil would help the United States economically, contributing to a strong economic base and also making the energy market more open and stable. It would deepen our strategic ties with key allies in Europe and in Asia. And it would give the United States additional critical leverage in the imposition of energy sanctions against adversaries. It would also greatly enhance our standing and our leadership around the world. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to explore the linkages between energy export and national security today, first with Senator Murkowski and then with the panel of experts that follows. Now I have the great pleasure and honor of introducing Senator Lisa Murkowski. She is the senior senator from Alaska, the great state of Alaska. She is chair of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee and also sits on the Senate Appropriations Committee. She is a real thought leader in this area. She's convened several hearings on the issue of crude oil export since January of 2014. She has just introduced new energy legislation this week, and again, is a real leading voice, a critical voice on these issues. So we're going to hear from Senator Murkowski. We'll then have a chance for Q&A, and then we'll turn to our panel. So please join me in welcoming Senator Lisa Murkowski.
Well, thank you and good morning. It is indeed a pleasure to be here with you this morning. Thank you for the introductions and congratulations to your team here at the Center for New American Security. The report that is out there, I see most of you have it on your desk and or on your table. If it's not, it's out there. But very timely, very informative, and probably most importantly, very accurate here. It should come as no surprise to any of you this morning that I certainly agree with the conclusions. It is time. It is well time that we lift the ban on crude oil exports. There are few issues, really, that intersect as clearly and neatly as national security and energy. We often talk about the benefits of exports in perhaps a theoretical case that benefits will or could bring, but this is not a theoretical prospect that we're talking about here. There is a time and a place for theory, and there's a time and a place for fact. So let me give you 5 quick facts here that you may or may not know about with regards to our nation's history on oil exports, and then some of the more recent implications of our export ban. First fact, during World War II, the United States exported tens of millions of barrels of crude oil to our allies. We're talking about Canada, the United Kingdom, India, Australia, elsewhere. The second fact, when Egypt seized control of the Suez Canal, President Eisenhower reacted decisively and ordered American oil to relieve what was called Europe's oil famine. Another fact, when Rhodesia cut off the flow of oil to Zambia in 1965, America stood with Britain to render assistance, delivering petroleum products in the Zambian airlift. And then another fact, in the 1970s, facing threat from multiple regimes, Israel secured an agreement with us here in the United States to supply it with oil in the event of a national emergency. And this was an agreement that was supported initially by President Gerald Ford, later by Jimmy Carter, then later by President Bill Clinton, and then further by President George W. Bush, and now President Barack Obama. So it is an agreement that has endured over the decades here. And then the last of my fast 5 facts. Former Ambassador Carlos Pascual and others have testified before my Committee, Energy and Natural Resources, that the sanctions against Iran, which brought Iran to the table, worked because of U.S. oil production that was on the rise and that we were hamstrung by our inability to export it. So we're in a position today where our friends and our trading partners are once again asking for our assistance. And the world has clearly changed. There's new alliances out there. There are definitely new threats out there, new hopes and new fears. But it remains my hope that while the world may have changed, our role as a global leader has not eroded. And this is an area, the area of exports, where I believe quite strongly that we have an opportunity to assert ourselves, to reassert ourselves as that global leader. The president has the authority now. No legislation needed. The president has the authority under the Energy Policy and Conservation Act to authorize oil exports for virtually any reason. But it stands to reason that members of NATO, such as Poland, who imports 96% of its oil from Russia, very little production of its own, Poland could right now request an exemption under the existing law. But it's not just Poland. How about our partners in Italy? Don't you think that they would like to diversify away from a traditional source of light sweet crude that they receive from Libya, which, of course, is always seemingly on the brink there? But this is not just a Europe-only possibility. Countries like Japan, South Korea, India, Singapore, and any other U.S. friend and ally could do the same. You'll recall it was just a couple weeks ago that the Prime Minister of Japan was here in Washington, D.C., had a chance to meet with the President, address the Congress, and believe me, the members of the Diet that were here, the members of his cabinet that I met with, I reminded them that this administration has that authority now, but the ask needs to be made. I believe that there would be strong bipartisan support for any exemptions should the administration be willing to grant them. This administration does get the benefits of exports. We're seeing that clearly this week as we're talking about the trade promotion agreement that is on the floor that we'll have an opportunity to vote on as early as this morning. The President's National Export Initiative reminds us that clearly in favor of exports there. The Council of Economic Advisors champions declining oil imports. Lifting the export ban would lower our net imports even further. The President's national security strategy talks about a collective understanding of energy security that does include our allies. And we need to keep this in context or in perspective as we recognize the administration's support for exports of liquefied natural gas. It's worth quoting directly from the final authorizations from the DOE's issues for LNG exports. They say, an efficient, transparent international market for natural gas with diverse sources of supply provides both economic and strategic benefits to the United States and our allies. So if you just replace the words natural gas with crude oil, you've made my argument there. You've made the argument there. And in speaking with so many in the administration, whether it be Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, even Secretary of Commerce, there is a recognition that this is a policy that needs to be addressed, that there is clearly, when we talk about the national security implications and the prospects for us should we lift that oil export ban, you've got the administration thinking. But you all are not here to hear me talk about things that the administration can and should do. You probably want to know what the Congress will do. The education effort is going on. As Michèle noted in her remarks, we've been doing a lot of talking, laying a lot of groundwork over this past year, but the education needs to continue. It has to. Our energy renaissance is relatively new, and it's going to take some time for some to understand its implications. I support oil exports because I want this energy renaissance to continue. I don't want it to fade away. And I believe that more and more policymakers will ultimately come to that same position. So on Tuesday night, I introduced the Energy Supply and Distribution Act. It's Senate Bill 1312, if you want to look it up online. I was joined by two of my friends from North Dakota, Senator Heitkamp and Senator John Hoeven, as well as many others who deserve to be applauded and thanked for joining early. Senator Barrasso of Wyoming, McCain of Arizona, Corker of Tennessee, Alexander of Tennessee, Risch of Idaho, Flake of Arizona, Capito of West Virginia, Inhofe of Oklahoma, Rubio of Florida, and Lankford of Oklahoma. So if you think about that, not everybody's from an oil-producing state here, but it's a strong group. It's a distinguished group. We have chairman of the Energy Committee, Armed Services, Foreign Relations, Environment and Public Works, and the Indian Affairs Committee, and we've got quite a few subcommittee chairmen on board as well. I expect that this group of 13 will only grow. We're working hard to recruit new co-sponsors. We've got good conversations going on both sides of the aisle. And as more and more organizations like yours endorse the end of export bans, senators will have more reason to join us. We will also be including this legislation, the Energy Supply and Distribution Act, on the agenda of a legislative hearing that we have scheduled for June 4th. This is going to be before the Energy Committee. This hearing will be on a collection of different bills that have been introduced for consideration of our emerging energy bill. We have broken this energy bill into 4 different titles. We'll be hearing the title on accountability and reform at that June 4th hearing. This is a package, this is a proposal that I'm working on aggressively with my ranking member, Senator Cantwell, on. And I think both of us are relatively pleased with the level of progress that we've made to date. So we're going to keep moving on it, and you should stay tuned for how this builds out further. But as far as exports specifically, our committee has already had 3 oversight hearings on exports. So it's good to have the hearings, but now we need to move to that next step, and that next step is the legislation itself. The bill itself is pretty simple. We borrow language straight from the Quadrennial Energy Review, incorporating some strong bipartisan ideas, and there's no great science with why we would incorporate language directly from the QER. My goal here is to change this policy. My goal is to lift the export ban. My goal is not to send a message. I need the support of the administration. So I figure if I borrow a little bit of their language from the QER, it makes it tougher for them to threaten a veto there. So we're working with everybody here. But included in the bill, we have the focus on energy security, task force on shared infrastructure, improved training on cross-border energy projects, and enhanced data collection on energy flows in North America with our partners in Mexico and Canada, the integrated approach there. But the last section of the bill fully repeals restrictions on oil exports, but it does preserve the emergency authorities of the president to block exports during emergencies, during a national security crisis, and certain other circumstances. We felt it was important to allow for this safety valve, if you will. We borrow the language on these authorities directly from the legislation that authorized oil exports from Alaska's North Slope that was passed some 20 years ago. It passed the Senate with a bipartisan vote of 74 to 25. It was signed into law by President Clinton. There's some folks out there that forget that the United States, through Alaska, has that ability to export our oil. We don't export a lot. The last time we sent a shipment was last year in 2014 to South Korea. But we do have those authorities in law. And it's worth reinforcing this point. It's not just what Alaska is able to do. We're already exporting some 400,000 barrels per day to Canada, and that's due to President Reagan's finding back in 1985. We can already export from California up to a certain amount, thanks to a finding by President George H.W. Bush, and then again, we can export currently from Alaska. And some have suggested that, well, the only reason you're interested in lifting this ban, Lisa, is because it's a parochial interest for you. Well, no, we're already able to do it. I am concerned with the national interest here. That's what this discussion is all about. The whole idea that oil exports would still be prohibited, to me, is just mind-boggling at times. The Commerce Department retains a list of commodities that are in short supply. They call it the short supply controls. And historically, these controls were generally not blanket prohibitions. They concerned items like aluminum or copper, iron, steel scrap, nickel, selenium, polio vaccine. The only items that still remain on this short supply controls list are crude oil, Western red cedar, and horses for export intended for slaughter. That's it. So there's also a little small caveat here that prohibits exports of petroleum products from the National Petroleum Reserve, but that's very small. So really what we're talking about in terms of those things that we've got an absolute prohibition on, it's horses for slaughter, Western red cedar, and crude oil. Now, we do have embargoes on North Korea, for example, and we control the export of other things such as sensitive technology. But crude oil's presence on the short supply controls is really pretty conspicuous if you think about it. We export our petroleum products at record levels. So that's going out of the country. But what we can't move is the crude. So we have come a long way since 2014 in January, when I unveiled a white paper at the Brookings Institute. We have conducted countless roundtables and think tank events. We've seen excellent analysis from folks like Liz Rosenberg here at CNAS, others at the Cato Institute, Aspen, CBO, GAO, EIA, Columbia University, Rice University, IHS, Resources for the Future. These studies have been underway over this past year. We anticipate that there is more to come. And with each study, it comes to that same conclusion about the benefits, the continued benefits of export. We've talked about condensate, about processed condensate, about swaps with Mexico and swaps with other countries, about a national interest finding for exports to Mexico, and most recently about national interest findings for other countries. And we've seen this support just continue to grow in the political world, in the business world, in the academic world, and certainly in the national security policy world. I said back in early 2014 that 2014 was going to be the year of the report, and suggested that 2015 would be the year of legislation. And that was a pretty easy prediction to fulfill. But with the introduction of our legislation, the Energy Supply and Distribution Act this week, and a legislative hearing now scheduled in exactly 3 weeks, I think we're moving in the right direction. So again, I thank you for your interest in this very, very important subject. I thank you for your support, and special thanks to the Center for New American Security for its important and ongoing work in this area. I look forward to learning more of the outcomes from your organization and to be working with you on these important issues of the day. And with that, I look forward to a chance for a few questions here.
Thank you, Senator, very much. So you noted the importance of a potential lifting of the ban for many of our allies in Europe and Asia, and the precedent, several historical precedents. Could you sort of spin out for us how you see, several years down the road, how would the lifting of the ban on crude oil exports play out in our alliance relationships over the coming years? How do you see that affecting things?
Well, we have a great deal of anxiety and uncertainty coming out of Russia right now. And Russia, as we all know, is a substantial, a major supplier of oil, particularly to the European nations. Again, friends, whether they be Poland, who is 96% dependent, Italy, Germany, you can go down the list of those nations that are our friends. Poland is a really clear example for us. Poland has been there with us with our national missile defense systems. They have been there with us in every conflict. They have been as steady and reliable a partner as we could want. And here they are sitting in a situation where 96% of their resource, their oil resource, comes from Russia right now. And so if we can alleviate that political tension for them, what does that do to strengthen our friendship and our alliance the next time we need their help or support? Move over to Asia. I mentioned the Prime Minister's visit here a couple weeks ago. Japan is one of those nations that continues to receive oil from Iran. They don't like the fact that despite the sanctions that are in place on Iranian oil, they need it because they are not able to access another source of supply right now. Don't you think that our friends and our partners in Japan would feel more comfortable if they too were able to say, no, we don't want to be receiving Iranian oil. We don't want more dollars to be going towards Iran. So when you think about the benefits of using our resource as a strategic asset, a national security strategic asset, this is what it's all about. And again, this is not something that is brand new. When you think about the historical timeline out there, we have used our resources to help our friends throughout the decades. Why now are we choosing to be so insular and say, no, you're gonna continue to rely on Iran, you're going to continue to rely on Mr. Putin? I don't think they want that, and we shouldn't want that.
So you mentioned the importance of having a bipartisan support for this policy change. And yet I think most of the sponsors so far are Republicans. So what are the kinds of, how do you bridge the gap? What are the kinds of issues that you think you're going to have to address to make more Democrats comfortable with this approach?
Well, what we're going to have to deal with, and what we are currently dealing with as we are bringing more people on, the discussion about how exports play into the national security piece, people are getting, and this is not a bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats, urban and rural, everybody understands. They can see the benefits there.
Right.
The anxiety comes from the domestic situation. What happens if we allow for exports of our crude, and then the price of oil, or the price of gas at the pump goes up? Then my constituents are going to be upset at me because I have supported a policy measure and a connecting of the dots that is not a legitimate connection, but it's one that people will perhaps jump to, and that's the concern. I think it's important that we do take time to remind people what you are putting in your car, what you are pumping at the filling station, is a refined product. That's not crude. We send that refined product all over the world. So if you're worried about exports increasing the cost at the pump, take it back a step. But also walking people through, again, the very considered analyses that have gone forward. I think part of it, though, is we're all suspect. I'm suspect because I come from the state of Alaska and I must want more for my state. I think it's going to be important to make sure that the message that is sent, that this does not increase the price of gas at the pump, that this will provide for greater jobs as we see increased production, and that this will enhance our national security and our geopolitical relationships around the world. We need to just be consistent and strong in that message. That's where we've got resistance. It's going to take, again, a little bit more education, but we're working it. We're working it pretty quickly and aggressively, and that's where I think forums like this really help.
Right. Wonderful. We're going to take just a couple of questions from the audience because the senator has to leave in about 1 minute. But maybe
we've got a big energy hearing this morning.
At least one question from the audience.
Yeah.
Do we have a bold volunteer? You can't fool me. I know you're not a shy crowd.
Yeah.
Yes, right here. Please tell us who you are and let us know your question.
Good morning. My name is Anthony Clark. I'm with the Securities and Exchange Commission. My question today is about the cybersecurity of oil infrastructure. So how do we make sure that oil infrastructure exported from the United States is done in a way that is secure from an infrastructure security standpoint, technologically? It's like cybersecurity or being attacked from outside.
Well, it's no different than any of the other cyber issues that we are dealing with. I think we recognize that these issues these areas are vulnerabilities that we have, whether it is our own energy infrastructure that we have within the country, or the idea that we would be free to allow for a level of exports. I will be the first to suggest to you that we do not have a system where I think we can say it's airtight, that we can give assurance that we are not going to be susceptible or more vulnerable. Do we need to be working on it? Absolutely. Can I give you any guarantees today? No. But I think it is something that needs to be in the thought process as we move forward with policy decisions, as we're talking about today. It's an important part of the conversation.
Senator, I wish we had more time, but I understand that you need to get back to your day job. Yeah. But thank you so much for kicking off our discussion. You've given us a lot to think about. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we are going to transition now to a really fabulous panel of experts to delve into these issues more deeply and to engage you in conversation. If you just bear with us for 2 or 3 minutes, we'll switch out the stage and the mics, and we'll resume with our panel conversation. Thank you.
Yep. Oh, excuse me. Yep.
On who?
Derek, you're on the end.
I'm on the end? Okay. You're in.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for sticking here with us. Hopefully we'll get some of those people who went to grab a cup of coffee. I'm Liz Rosenberg. I'm the director of the Energy, Environment, and Security Program at the Center for New American Security, and I'm glad that you're here to join us for this conversation on crude export and national security. So as you've heard and are probably aware, there's been quite a lot of analyst and expert agreement on the market and economic benefits of exporting crude from the United States, although the conversation around the foreign policy and national security benefits has been not as active in the public domain. It is becoming more so, and it's certainly a very relevant and important set of considerations for energy policy making more broadly. And we've seen the increase in conversation around this set of issues. It's been discussed in congressional hearings, and of course, the public discourse. Many of you may have seen the foreign policy article by Senators Murkowski, McCain, and Corker on this issue, amongst other analysts of the topic. So we are continuing that conversation on energy and national security implications in this forum today and at CNAS by bringing in more foreign policy, national security voices into the conversation. Additionally, given the significance of the export of U.S. energy supplies and crude in particular to Asia as a region of burgeoning economic growth and energy demand, we've organized this panel to not only discuss the foreign policy and national security considerations of exporting crude oil, but the implications for Asia in particular and on U.S. and Asian relations, strategic relations. We have several distinguished experts on these topics here with us today to discuss them. We have Erica Downs, senior analyst at the Eurasia Group, and to my immediate left, Bob McNally, founder and president of the Rapidan Group. To Erica's left, David Gordon, who is president of International Capital Strategies and an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. And finally, last but not least, Derek Scissors, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Group. So we'll run this panel as a facilitated conversation for about 30 minutes or so, and then open up the floor to your questions. And I'd like to start by asking Bob to draw us a picture of the energy landscape in the United States over the last several years. And why has and ask you specifically, why has the debate about export of crude become so relevant in the most recent past? And if this ban were put in place, what would that mean for this energy revolution that has been taking place and occurring over the last several years?
Thank you very much, Liz, and congratulations to you and CNAS for a great report and a great event. As I look out into the crowd and on the panel, I see a lot of seasoned experts who I sense know the story as well as I do, and I've been watching it as long, if not longer, than I have, and you have to say the last 5 to 6 years teaches us once again watching oil markets and energy security really is a humbling experience. When I was in the White House 13 years ago, we were looking at 60% plus import dependence and worrying about becoming as dependent on LNG. And when we were attacked on 9/11, the main thought was to start filling up the SPR as fast as possible. But look how things have changed. If you look at from the history of the oil markets, in the very first day of Colonel Drake in 1859 until now, it's the Americans, American companies and workers, geologists, entrepreneurs, financiers have just wrought one miracle after the other in terms of bringing new supply. That has challenges in terms of price stability we can talk about. In the last few years is no different. So our oil supply has gone, production has gone from 5 million barrels a day to 9 million barrels a day in the last several years, up 70%. Our demand has been soft, and so our imports have collapsed from the 60% range down to the mid-20% range. An astounding turnaround, again, nobody saw before it just was about to break upon us, ought to make us humble about our ability really to predict the future and so forth. So it's a complete sea change. The reason this sea change and the sudden now abundance of energy we have, the declining imports, raises the export question because we had forgotten about it since the 1970s. It was just unfinished business when we were dismantling the price controls and other mechanisms that were put in place in 1970 that were seen to be harmful. We just left the crude oil export price ban off the list for some reason. And we didn't think about it until recently because we always were concerned about importing oil. And the idea that we'd have oil to export was kind of absurd and kind of moot. We had other things to worry about. But also the reason why it's relevant, as you all well know, gets into the quality and the types of oil. All right? The rest of the world likes to consume distillate, and it runs its petrochemical industry on oil-based inputs. The United States likes to consume gasoline, and we chose natural gas for our inputs for petchem. So as a result, simplifying here massively, we like to run very complex refineries that take coffee ground quality crude and turn it into champagne gasoline. The oil that we found in the last few years has been of the higher quality that is more suitable for the simpler refineries and the oil-based petrochemical industries in Asia and Europe. And that gives rise to the obvious market opportunity for us to be able to have the opportunity to sell the oil. And a final point just on that, it's not like the United States government's going to say where this oil is going to go or not. It's just going to remove an obstacle that serves no public purpose whatsoever. As to where it goes, the market will determine that. We've seen what few condensate cargoes have gotten out go to both Europe and to Asia. The trading companies will take that and decide where it has to go. But it really gets back to what Senator Murkowski is talking about with Japan or Italy or some country. If we lose Libya again, or we decide to close the Iranian condensate loophole in the sanctions currently, won't we want our allies to have the option to buy that sort of surplus, if you will, light oil and condensate, which serves really no purpose to bottle up in our own countries? Those are the, I think, circumstances that give rise to the current debate.
Right. Well, thank you. David, let me turn to you and ask about the economic benefits for the United States that have accrued because of this revolution in energy production domestically, and also how you see economic growth, balance of trade changing or modifying if this ban on most exports of crude were to be lifted in the United States.
Yeah, thank you very much, Liz. A few quick points. I think that Bob made the point about the dramatic shift between exports and imports on the energy side. It's had a very positive impact on the balance of payments and the balance of trade. Really, both through shifting imports and exports, but also importantly, putting some downward pressure on price. So I think that's been quite important. It's had a direct impact on reinvigorating U.S. industry, and a lot of what we've seen over the past several years of the reemergence of the U.S. as an industrial power, investments in industry, in manufacturing, I think is tied to this domestic production of oil. In macroeconomic terms, I think that the one huge impact of the energy revolution has been to strengthen the dollar and to reinforce the status of the dollar as a reserve currency. Now, that has some mixed effects. So in some ways, I think the dollar may be getting too strong now. It's a function of weakness elsewhere in the world. But a strong dollar, very important for U.S. strength, very, very important for the continued attractiveness of the U.S. as an investment target for foreign companies. I think that the energy revolution connected to the strengthening of the dollar was probably the most important factor in challenging the notion that was really rampant during and in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, that the U.S. is really a power in decline. And then I think perhaps most importantly of all of these is the larger international effect of U.S. production in the last year and a half or so, as tensions in the Middle East really became exacerbated. What we saw was a delinkage from what had been a decades-long pattern of tensions in the Middle East leading to immediate upward pressure in energy prices. And if you hadn't had that extra 1 million barrels a year having come online, I think right now we would be looking at a really dire global economic situation of very, very high oil prices as a result of geopolitical tensions in the Middle East. We'd probably, frankly, be in another global recession. So I think that the importance of the export ban here and looking ahead is all of this could take place basically in some sense through import substitution. And we're now at a point where that, again, to dramatically oversimplify, that's beginning to run out of steam. And the continued viability of the energy revolution will be dependent upon opening up not just the U.S. market, but the global market as a target for consumption of that production. So I think that especially in the context of weakening energy prices, that opening up the export side of the market is critical for sustaining the competitiveness of the U.S. as an investment target here. And that I think Senator Murkowski is absolutely right that the continued dynamism of the energy revolution here in the U.S. is at risk now if we don't address this issue in a way that could create those external opportunities.
Okay. I'm going to take this a little bit further here and ask if we can drill down specifically on Asia and flipping the question to the economic and strategic significance for Asian partners of the United States. what would they be if the United States were to change its policy on crude export and facilitate or even promote the greater potential export of crude oil? And after which, Derek, as a heads up, I'm going to come to you to talk specifically about the Chinese economy, their growth expectations.
Yeah, so I was actually talking to Michèle about this before our session. And in my view, right now, for strategic reassurance of U.S. allies in Asia, the economic and energy side of this is at least as important as the military side. And I think first and foremost in that is the Trans-Pacific Partnership and getting that in place and really saying to our Asian partners that the U.S. has a long-term commitment to Asia. The second piece of that is to open up the energy export sector, both LNG and ultimately crude oil, to basically, and I think Senator Murkowski got it right, to create an alternative, reliable source of energy imports. All of the Asian countries worry about imports, where their oil is going to come from. They're all concerned about instability in the Middle East. Asia is very dependent on the Middle East. Asia has been in a non-satisfactory price structure where they pay more for imported energy, particularly LNG, than other parts of the world. All of this is enhanced if you add on a significant, important new source of reliable energy, and the Trans-Pacific energy relationship, I think, is again, next to TPP, the most important thing that we can do to reassure our allies and to give incentives for others as well to become partners with us.
Okay, so taking this forward, Derek, do you agree? And can you talk a little bit about why not, what China's outlook is on growth, economic growth, and energy demand specifically? How significant is it to China to include more U.S. supplies in its diversity of crude supplies?
First of all, I do agree with David completely, and I would start with his remarks and just add the fact that, of course, TPP status, its size, are relevant to our ability to export energy. We could have in the case that we have a long-term regime, I'm not advocating this, I'm just saying, where we can more freely export to our free trade partners than we can to everyone else, then participation in TPP for Japan and Korea especially becomes exceptionally important. So the two are related. If TPP fails, and we desperately need an economic component to the outreach to Asia, as David just said, energy is the obvious one, and then we need even more than just lifting the crude export ban. We need a plan of how we're going to do this if TPP were to stumble, which I spend every day on, so personally it would be very upsetting for me. Putting that aside for the moment. China, I'm a China bear, long-term China bear, and now everyone is more bearish than they were 4 or 5 years ago. But I'm even still more bearish than the current mainstream. I think it's possible that outright economic stagnation in China, I think that's not only possible, I would probably pick that as the single most likely outcome, pending reform choices that haven't really been made. So in that situation, you could have energy demand growth will certainly slow. It actually could stop. Now, that's very misleading because coal is already shrinking. Hydro is pretty much tapped out as a source of new energy. Oil, you'll still get Chinese oil demand rising, even in a very bearish situation where energy demand growth halts. And then other things, gas is going to soar, gas use is going to soar, nuclear power is going to soar, wind and solar, it will depend on pricing and some other issues within China. But even if you take the bearish case, there are vast differences in the sources of Chinese energy demand. Now, in terms of something that I've followed for 15 years, China's pursuit of energy around the world, there's already been a sea change. The Chinese have become much more selective. So if you went back to the 90s, you would see the Chinese sort of desperately trying to get the Russians to commit to some sort of long-term energy supply framework, and now it's the Russians making stuff up, which you cannot find on the Chinese side at all, about what China and Russia are going to do together. I mean, not that there isn't some cooperation, but there's also a great deal of exaggeration on the Russian side. Coal imports are vanishing as quickly as they appeared for China. So China's outward energy drive is very different than it was. In terms of the U.S. role, there are two things. One thing is just a fun fact I like to tell people. The number 2 supplier of liquefied petroleum gas to China is now the U.S., 3 times larger than Saudi Arabia, and I want to break out into a USA, USA, USA chant at this point. And that ties to the real point, which is energy is not a big portion of the U.S.-China relationship right now. It's such an enormous relationship across any dimensions. It's very hard to imagine direct energy trade between the U.S. and China becoming that important. But the success in the U.S. puts a lot of pressure on the Chinese. They see that we got ourselves off Middle Eastern oil. Now we're getting ourselves off of imports entirely. The Chinese energy sector is organized completely different than the U.S. energy sector. I mean, U.S. shale comes from little firms jumping into the market and being able to buy land freely and getting financial support. None of that exists in China. Commercial credit markets aren't commercial. You have state monopolization. Massive problems with any sort of real private ownership of land. So what we're doing, probably the biggest effect of U.S. energy decisions on China is to hold up a model that shows theirs fails. And you all remember 6 years ago, state oil companies were taking over the world. Not in my world, but in some people's world. Now we have, for the Chinese, looking at the U.S., and they watch us very closely, a clear sign that they're doing something fundamentally wrong. It doesn't mean they're going to have the nerve to engage in the reform. That's getting back to my bearishness at the beginning, but that's probably the biggest impact. We're putting a lot of pressure on their energy sector, not by threatening them or coercing them, but just by being much more successful.
Right, a model. Erica, turning to you and carrying forward from this point, can you talk a little bit about the relationship, the energy supply relationship that China has with Russia, and how learning from the example of the United States on a production, from the production level, and also learning from the conversation in the United States about how public policymakers want to organize trade and international trade, what will that look like for China going forward in its energy supply balancing?
Sure, thank you. So on the China-Russia relationship, from the China perspective, Russia is an important supplier of oil, number 3 last year behind Saudi Arabia and Angola. And Russia is poised to become a major supplier of natural gas to China once the Power of Siberia pipeline, the agreement for which was finalized a year ago. Once that goes into operation, circa 2020, depending on a number of factors. That said, right now China has the upper hand in the bilateral energy relationship, due, I think, first and foremost to the lower oil price environment, but also U.S. and EU sanctions and Russia's increasing international isolation. Over the past year, the Russians have put a number of big energy goodies on the negotiating table, and the Chinese have not yet taken them. We've seen the offer, and this was reaffirmed with the meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow last weekend. But the Russians have offered to build a second natural gas pipeline from West Siberia down to China. They've offered China a stake in the constellation of Vankor oil fields, so one of the crown jewels in East Siberia. Vankor itself has peaked, but some of the other fields around it certainly have room to grow. And then there's an LNG project, Yamal LNG, in which a Chinese company has a 20% stake, and Total is also involved, and they're waiting for Chinese financing. The Russian company involved, Novatek, keeps saying, third quarter this year. They're expecting about $15 billion from the Chinese. So we'll have to wait and see there. And I think a lot of this, why aren't the Chinese snatching these goodies off the table? 10 years ago. it might have been a different story. I think there are a couple of things going on. I think there's uncertainty about Russian foreign policy and the response of the U.S. and the EU. What's going to happen with sanctions? Could sanctions be changed in such a way that would make it difficult to move forward on these projects? And of course, for Chinese banks that have exposure in the United States, there's a reluctance to do anything to run afoul of any U.S. sanctions, current or future ones. There are concerns about oil price volatility. I think this has been a big issue in valuing the Vancor oil field. I think that you have a lot of people in China that would like to take, in theory, this sounds like a great idea, but how do you value it? When you've seen what crude oil prices have done, over the past year, and of course, to get back to one of the points that that Derek made, that Chinese energy demand growth is slowing. Oil demand growth has been decelerating in recent years, and I expect that will continue. It's not just because of slower economic growth and less oil-intensive growth, but also because of policies at the central and local government levels that have been put in place to moderate demand growth. Natural gas, I am a bit more bullish about long-term. Right now, natural gas growth in China is much slower than it's been in recent years. A big part of that has to do with some natural gas price reform issues, which we can get into later. But bottom line here is that right now China's well supplied with natural gas through 2020. So there's not the same urgency to secure supplies that there was in years past when the economy and energy demand across the board was growing much more quickly. In terms of China's energy trade, so I think looking at oil and natural gas, diversity has been and continues to be a big driver. There's an interest not just in a diversity of suppliers, but also in a diversity of import routes. The overland component is quite important, and that's one of the reasons we've seen, pipelines being built and, plans for additional pipelines to carry, oil and gas from Russia and Central Asia and from Myanmar. I think if the U.S. were to start exporting crude oil, I wouldn't be surprised if China took some of those barrels. I don't think they'd be as prized as, say, Russian barrels are. But diversity is key. But my sense is from the conversations I've had in China recently that this isn't a high priority issue, in part because it seems like it's something so far in the future. And when you talk to people in China about the prospect of of greater U.S. energy exports to China, the focus really has been on LNG. And I'll stop there.
Okay. I'm going to ask another question to Erica and Bob about energy governance, after which I will turn to the audience so you can think about your questions in preparation. So on energy governance and on crude export, putting the two together, China will focus on energy governance significantly as one of its main platforms for its leadership of the G20 upcoming. And the United States has, of course, played a significant role in global energy leadership and some aspects of energy governance globally over the last several decades. But given the position of the disposition of the U.S. energy sector and the crude export policies restricting this flow, it seems to me that the United States is undermining its own leadership, its own energy governance, in holding on to protectionist energy policies. And now, as China is planning on elevating this conversation on energy governance globally, the United States finds itself in an awkward position, particularly on the issue of promoting free trade in energy, which is a priority for so many lawmakers. So, Bob, if I can turn to you and ask, in what ways specifically is the United States leading or failing to lead on energy governance when it comes to its current policy on crude export?
Yeah, well, I think to start off, I think it's clear from this discussion, and in general, whether or not China's rise is harmonious or peaceful on the one hand, or acrimonious and volatile on the other, is one of the most important questions in our lives, really, going forward. On the energy side, I think we have to realize China is going through the same 12-step program and needs the same support group that we've been in for the last 40, 50 years, when a major growing country realizes its economic vitality and national security depends on the free flow of liquids from the volatile Middle East to its ports. This is a horrifying, terrible thing. We are welcome. There's a support group meeting every Thursday. China's now coming in. they are doing the same things we did, right? And it involves domestic governance and to some degree international governments. In some areas, the United States, I think our policy should be to hope for the best but prepare for the worst. On the hope for the best part, I think in some ways we are leading, but we could be doing more with regard to helping China rise in a more harmonious way. What do I mean? Well, China is looking to decontrol product prices, make its petroleum sector more efficient. It is looking to clean up its energy sector. It could use and has gotten some U.S. expertise, both technology and policy-wise, to improve the environment and the environmental consequences of oil use. And that's one area I think you have seen both countries, but both rather Democratic and Republican administrations work well with China on. We've had some efforts to try to get China to come into the IEA system of building, holding, and collectively using strategic stocks so that we avoid hoarding and unilateral moves in the event of crises and so forth. And China has to be a willing partner there, but China, India, and other countries, this is an area where, again, there's been some movement. We could probably push a little further. But with regard to trade, here I think we are failing to seize a clear opportunity. Again, you look around town, there's just a clear consensus among, I think, thought leaders and policymakers on both parties who've really looked at this issue that the ban makes no sense, and removing it could allow the United States to obtain significant geopolitical benefits. And were we to remove this ban, given that really China's not looking for our oil so much right now, it primarily would be a symbolic fillip for worried Japan and South Korea that are concerned that we're withdrawing from Asia, we're going to leave them to the Chinese. The Washington Post reported today we're getting ready, the Defense Department may decide to send some ships within 12 miles of some of those artificial islands China's building in the Southeast Asia. That's a symbolic step. Who cares? A boat goes 12. Well, believe me, that symbolic step will, if we take it, will have real meaning in capitals all over Asia. Were we to lift the ban, even if Japan and South Korea only took a few more cargoes of condensate and started to take only a few cargoes of light oil, that'll be determined by the market. The symbolism of that would be enormous. But on the sunnier side of the mountain, were we to lift the ban in the context of this more productive conversation we want to have with China about their energy growth, we could say to them, look, you behave well, and we're going to share our crude with you just as we do the LPG. And this shows you that we want you, as you rise and join us in the terrified support group of countries that have to import from the Middle East club, that we can work harmoniously on collective security in the region and the sea lanes back, on pollution control, on strategic reserves, all the things we've been working on for the last few decades. There's a place for you if you behave. So I think it could be a really both an optimistic and a sort of a stick we could wield a bit too.
Erica, do you want to add anything to that? Or?
Sure, just a couple of quick points. One, to pick up on what Bob and David and some others have said in terms of lifting the ban on U.S. crude oil imports and what that means for Asia. To the extent that we want to ensure that energy, does not become a source of tension between states and, the region, then certainly exports to the region, even if they're just going, say, to Japan or South Korea, is useful because, the more countries in the region feel that they are well supplied, that they have access to reliable supplies, the less likely, they are to be concerned that there's not enough to go around, and see themselves in sort of zero-sum competition with other states in the region for energy, which, of course, if we sort of go back a decade, pre-U.S. shale boom, that's very much what we saw, when China's energy demand and oil demand in particular was rising quite quickly. There really was very much a sense that there wasn't enough oil going around. And, I remember sort of fielding questions 10 years ago about, was there going to be a conflict between China and Japan or, China and the United States, over oil? It may seem funny to talk about that today when the world is awash in oil, but that may not always be the case. So I think that's important to keep in mind going forward. And then just on the energy governance issue, I'm going to go back to the institutions. As Liz mentioned, China is going to be assuming the presidency of the G20 next year. They're very interested in having energy be a theme of that. They're looking for ways for the G20 to play a larger role in global energy governance. And so I think, sort of getting back to the question of, what can the U.S. do? I think it's sort of useful for the U.S. And these are not easy questions to address. but to sort of look at ways to sort of help China have a louder voice, to have more influence over the international energy architecture. As many of you know, these institutions have not kept pace with changes in the world energy market. I think it's understandable that China would want a larger role, and the question is, how do you bring China in? And I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here, but I think it's highly relevant. If you look at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the AIIB, that China has championed the creation of, part of that was, there are a lot of parallels, I think, to energy, and that China was looking for, a way to have more influence over international financial institutions, and I think was quite frustrated with the slow pace of reform of existing institutions, and in particular, the failure of the U.S. Congress to pass legislation that would have given China and other emerging economies a larger role, more say in institutions like the IMF. I'm not saying that, the failure to pass this legislation is what led to the creation, of the AIIB. I suspect this might have happened anyways, but it was certainly a factor. And there are certain parallels on the energy side where China's not a member of the IEA. I think Bob's right that there are some factors on the China side that are precluding that, but there's also, if you sort of look at the requirements to belong in the IEA, which, in turn depend on requirements to be in the OECD, China doesn't meet any of those. And so I think it's not surprising that sort of China's looking for other ways to play a role in energy governance. This is not to say that China wants to upend the IEA or will stop engaging with the IEA. So I think they've benefited quite a bit from engagements with the IEA, but they are looking, to create new institutions, to establish other tables at which they can have a seat. And so I think, if we're going to learn from, the experience of the AIIB, I think it's sort of useful to sort of be involved in those conversations with China.
There's, yes, two fingers. Yeah.
No, it's about India.
India, yes. Yeah.
Okay, so if you want to, okay. So we just haven't mentioned India, and I think India is a useful example of thinking about the indirect effects of U.S. energy exports. I don't anticipate, and we don't really know the scope of the U.S. production expansion if we play it out fully. I don't anticipate a lot of U.S. energy going to India. Europe and Japan, Korea are going to grab it, and it's just, there's geography. India's much closer to the Middle East. I mean, there's some obvious factors there, but it really helps the Indian economy for oil prices to stay low. And as the U.S. contributes globally to lower oil prices and plays a stabilizing role, my colleagues have talked about when there is unrest in the Middle East, that just accumulates a lot of benefits to India over time. And, U.S.-India relations are such that we might have to remind India that we are, in fact, contributing to their economic welfare on occasion. But nonetheless, there are actually indirect effects of U.S. energy policy on India. India is a prime example, and other countries that are not going to receive a lot of U.S. energy. India is very, very price sensitive with some balance of payments or potential balance of payments issues. So even though someone could say, hey, well, we're not going to ship any oil to India, it doesn't matter. It actually still does. And it's something that we should remember, that it's not maybe a first-order effect, but it's an important second-order effect in the region.
I'm going to have two more comments here, and then we're coming to you. Yes.
I just want to reiterate, I think that Erica made a really important point, that as you shift away from assumptions of scarcity in the market to a more abundant and resilient market, that in and of itself puts downward pressure on interstate rivalries in the Western Pacific. That's a really important thing, and the U.S. unconventional production piece of that has been critical, and so that I think that there's been, it's not 10 years ago, it's 3 or 4 years ago, you still had that talk from China, and I think that it's in a world in which there's just much less angst about where your supply is going to come from, that you can take down the temperature, and anything that has common benefits for China, Japan, and Korea, I think is a positive thing for Asian security, particularly if it's sourced in the United States.
Right, so an issue we're dancing around here is the nature of U.S. production and what what that therefore means if there is a policy decision to allow, to facilitate, to promote the export of U.S. crude. So it is because of the nature of this U.S. production, which is a kind of, the U.S. producers become a kind of a swing producer, not of the same nature as Saudi Arabia in the way we traditionally have understood that, but the combination of that, the nature of this kind of production, which is relatively agile, nimble, plus the easier ability to export that crude will combine to have these effects you're talking about. If you want to add one more thing.
Well, you made the point I was going to make, Liz. I think it's an excellent point. Just briefly in history, remember going back to 1859, the first well, we've known kind of U.S. has led the way, but the main problem that has vexed industry and governments since 1859 has been oil prices' tendency towards wild gyrations, boom and bust cycles. That is why through history, governments and industry have created and tolerated 3 OPECs, if you will, to stabilize the price of oil. Because the only thing worse than that is this price volatility, which is awful. Unacceptable for defense planners, for car makers, for central bankers, just about everybody can't stand the volatility. Rockefeller, Texas Railroad Commission, Seven Sisters, and then until recently OPEC. In 2008, we saw Saudi Arabia fail to cap the price in peacetime. It ran out of its spare capacity, the tool it uses to stabilize prices. And now we see they won't use their spare capacity or increase it by cutting production. So Saudi Arabia no longer can or will play that price stabilizing role. We may be entering an era where these price gyrations are going to return. In that response, in that context, it's all the more important that we remove the oil ban, which threatens investment in U.S. shale oil production, because as Liz exactly said, right, while we're not Saudi Arabia, we're not going to flip shale oil on in 30 days and sustain it for 90. We're going to find out how responsive it is during the experiment we're in this year. It adds flexibility to what is otherwise a very inflexible supply side. And so the oscillation of the oil prices we may see because of OPEC's either inability or unwillingness to play that price governing role will be less than it would have been without shale. Another good important reason matters for not only for India, but every other country on earth, including the United States.
Right, great. Okay, so we'll turn to your questions, and we'll start here towards the front. There's a microphone coming to you.
Thank you. Nicholas Bashur, Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Actually, it's a good transition from your last comment, because I wanted to see if you can have a conversation about the price of production and the profit margin in the industry, because the problem with Saudi Arabia and the issue with their spare capacity and the price controls is not that how much they can produce and how fast they can do it, it's how cheaply they can do it versus American producers. So they can withstand lower prices for a lot longer and still hold off better than American producers, and they're already trying to take out American producers even when we are not exporting oil. So what are the market conditions, or what are the situations under which we can still export oil and American producers can still turn a profit, because their profit margins are a lot lower than Saudi Arabia's?
Right.
A good question, very apropos in a low oil price environment in particular.
Well, again, whether it was the Texas Railroad Commission in its prorationing orders from 35 until 72, or Saudi Arabia, chiefly among OPEC countries, the way producers have attempted to suppress that price volatility is by withholding lower cost oil from the market and injecting it when there are imbalances or disruptions and removing it. It's a costly thing to do because you have to invest in those fields. It's like a fire department. It's an expensive toy to have, but you really need it if you want to control prices. So, as you said, Saudi Arabia, we saw this in 1985 as well, can decide for policy matters to flood the market by opening up its taps. It can produce at $10 or $15 a barrel oil, where you need much higher prices to sustain U.S. shale oil production. So I think you're seeing an attempt now to slow down the rate of production growth in shale. But I want to make a comment, though, about how I think Saudi Arabia views shale. I think there's a tendency here to say it's sort of Saudi Arabia against shale, and it's a noon on a western kind of old town, and only one person's going for drinks afterwards. I think that's wrong. Saudi officials have said publicly and privately that they actually love shale, and I believe they believe it. They love shale for the reason we were talking about earlier, that it's more flexible. They see sort of the United States as sort of the unwilling 13th member of OPEC, sort of, that really will have no choice but to slow down its production growth when the price of oil falls. And so if Saudi Arabia makes a calculation in OPEC that we simply have too much supply coming relative to the demand we're seeing in this kind of weak economy, somebody needs to slow down. 10 years ago, it would have been Saudi Arabia doing that heavy lifting. Now they can say, you know what, we're going to let prices drop a little while. Instead of doing 1 million barrels a day of supply from the U.S., we'll do 500. But as the Saudis have said, they think of shale as a blessing because without it, as we discussed earlier, we would have had $150 oil or plus with the disruptions we've seen and so forth. So they saw shale's ability to swing up as beneficial, but they also want shale to now swing down a little bit. But I think when you talk to the Saudis or just about anybody else and you look beyond 2020 and you see 7 billion people on the planet don't have the access to the energy that the billion of us in the OECD have, very strong demand growth potentially, they're going to need that shale to swing up later. So I think it's just this, it's not that sort of Saudi Arabia's low-cost oil against ours for the long run, we'll see who wins. It's more in periods of oversupply, who has to do the slowing? And the Saudis are saying, let the new kids on the block do it. But when we need them in 4 years, let them rise as well.
Okay. I think we'll come to the back over here.
Thank you. Jamie Webster with IHS. A question for the panel. We're in between OPEC meetings. We're coming up to the next OPEC meeting. Some of the things that have happened aside from what's going on in the slowdown in U.S. production, stronger demand, but one of the big things is, of course, a new king within Saudi Arabia and a lot of the changes that he's made over the last couple of weeks. How do you think that might change their calculation, both for this meeting, which I know at least a couple of us will be there, and for how this might change their thinking in the future? What's your kind of read on that?
If I may, I'm going to add to your question and piggyback with a subsequent one, which is how will East Asian consumers be thinking about the decision-making calculus and change in Saudi Arabia? So to pick up on that, why don't you go ahead first?
Yeah, I mean, I think that given the momentum in the Iranian nuclear negotiations and the increasing likelihood that we're going to get some kind of an agreement there, I think that the Saudis and OPEC generally will be really loath to reopen this question of supply constraint. That the last thing the Saudis and the other Gulf states want at a time when Iran will be coming back into the market is to create space for that to happen. They want, I mean, they are gearing up for a big fight over market share. And so I think that the timing of this meeting just it really makes it absolutely implausible to me for any kind of a shift. Now, over time, I think the Saudis might again see OPEC as a tool for limiting Iranian and Iraqi production. And this discussion that was reported this week in the media about OPEC being very pessimistic about where the price is going over the long term and wanting to reopen this question of supply management, I think is geared to a long-term view actually of bringing Iran and Iraq into price management. I think that in practice they would also want it to be OPEC plus in terms of bringing Russia, Norway, perhaps Mexico. And I think Bob's absolutely right. The Americans play in there, but not at the political level because the market will drive U.S. participation in that. But the important thing now is that in the face of the likelihood of an Iranian nuclear deal. I think it's just absolutely not on to rethink the strategy at this point and for this meeting.
So we're thinking about flooded market, conflict in OPEC, and volatility down the road, depending on how that plays out. So how do consumers think about that? So I just mentioned China, East Asia, and U.S. producers. How should they be thinking about that going forward?
East Asian consumers will be a big beneficiary of this because they're going to be able to drive deals and bargains there. I think from that perspective, it's going to increase their leverage. I mean, we've already seen China's leverage increase vis-a-vis Russia, but I think this will add the Middle East to that.
There's an opportunity here for energy reform in a number of these countries. They're different situations. The Chinese have one kind of situation, the Indians have another situation. Japan, of course, is a huge issue with nuclear power. And the countries have all taken small steps forward, sort of cutting subsidies and engaging in some sort of price reform. I think it's a little too easy right now. We had this, oh, look, oil prices are low. Suddenly we're reformers and we love the market. The test is going to be when oil prices go back up. And we'll see if Asia is willing to stick to its progress in liberalizing energy markets. So this is, of course, a short-term boon to Asian economies, some more than others. Again, I think it's the biggest boon perhaps to the Indians, but definitely a boon to a number of Asian economies, a boon to Asian consumers. But the question is whether this can be parlayed into something that's useful long-term. That relies on smart government policy. And right now we have easy government policy, which is a lot different than smart government policy.
Right. The reason why I think this is worth discussing, even though it is a broader picture than narrowly focusing on the U.S. export question, is because this is, of course, the important context in which we should think about, in taking the long view, how change in U.S. export policy will play out with a set of consumers globally and, in many respects, competitor producers.
I mean, we don't determine Chinese, Indian, Japanese choices in energy reform, so that's just giving the U.S. way too much credit. But if we want them to make smart choices, liberalizing choices, we need to, one, be a model, and two, our little contribution to stability in oil prices is a positive. It's not a huge positive, but it is a positive.
Right.
I have actually two.
We'll take a quick rejoinder and then move into the third row.
Okay, just two points building off what everyone else said. I mean, one on the China-Saudi relationship where you started. Saudi Arabia has consistently been a very reliable supplier to China. The Saudis have gone out of their way, especially over the past decade, to reassure the Chinese that they will always be there to meet China's energy needs, and they've continued to consistently deliver that message through this spring. So I expect that Saudi will continue to be China's top supplier. And that the Chinese will, continue to view it as a very reliable energy partner. And then on the energy reform story with China and the oil prices, obviously, yes, China's, a big consumer of oil, and Chinese, motorists are enjoying, the lowest prices at the pump since, 2009, 2010. But it's important to point out that that the low oil prices, I think have sort of, in a way, thrown a wrench into China's plans to sort of let market forces play a decisive, role in setting energy prices. The state still sets prices for diesel and gasoline, but if you look, and they move these prices every 10 working days in line with fluctuations in global crude prices. But if you look at what happened from late July 2014 through the end of last year, every 10 working days, when the Chinese saw that Brent and WTI fell, yes, they adjusted prices, but the magnitude of those changes were much smaller than the changes on the global market. So when you had Brent and WTI falling by 60% over this period, domestic diesel and gasoline prices have fallen by only fell by about 30% in China. And so there was this real struggle here that, yes, we want marketplace forces to play a larger role in setting prices, but we don't want this to upend our environmental and energy security agendas. And it's worth noting that, over the past, 3 times that the Chinese have lifted prices at the pump, the most recent one being earlier this week, that those increases have actually more or less, kept pace with the magnitude of change in WTI and Brent.
Thank you. Here, in the second row.
Good morning, Sanjit Dekka, Strategic Risk Services at Deloitte. How do you see increased U.S. exports impacting politically volatile hydrocarbon exporting states, like let's say Nigeria, for example, which depend on export-generated revenue to maintain the semblance of stability? I mean, there's tremendous strategic opportunities for the United States, no doubt. I think your report for sure elaborates that. But then there's also a national interest that the United States has in places like West Africa in terms of terrorism and security. And Nigeria, clearly, there's a connection between oil-generated revenue and their ability to provide security in that region and commitments with AU at large.
Well, yes. I mean, we've seen in the collapse in imports, we're talking about import substitution, which has been the main sort of trade reaction to the oil boom in the United States on the crude oil side. And we've seen a collapse in imports to the United States from Nigeria and other producers of similar quality crude to light tight oil, Algeria, Angola as well. Just about zeroed out. I think we're not taking any more, just about none. And so they have been the loudest voices in OPEC to complain about this. They have taken it on the chin, if you will. And so now they are forced to sell their crude into a more crowded Atlantic basin and or price it really low so they can put it on a boat and send it all the way to China. But you know what? The oil market's a risky business. I think Nigeria has much bigger problems than the United States shale oil production. You can also point to Libya going off. It was at 1.5 million barrels a day until several years ago. Went down to 0. Now is at about 500,000 or 600,000 barrels a day. So when Libya has problems, Nigeria and Algeria benefit. So I don't want to say that I'm unsympathetic, but the oil market is a dangerous, risky place, and there are winners and losers. And you know, again, starting out where I started my remarks, it's always risky to predict especially the future in oil markets. And you know, I think right now they're taking it on the chin, but you never know what's going to happen in the future. Things could change.
I mean, I think the Nigerians are as big a loser as you can find in this, because again, what they produce is directly competitive with what we produce. And I mean, in general, a lot of the investment in African energy resources in recent years was driven by the scarcity hypothesis, the peak oil hypothesis, and the notion that you just had to go wherever the stuff was. Nigeria, even compared to some other African producers, has these enormous governance issues around oil. I think the best thing that can be said for this and its impact in Nigeria, particularly in the context of a new government there, is that it will really put a premium on cleaning up the oil sector and having the government take a much greater control of it, because the rents from oil in Nigeria over the years, only a relatively small fraction of them had accrued to the public's benefit and had accrued even into the government fisc. And I think that's what this crisis will provide an opportunity for Nigeria to address.
Okay, thanks. We had a question here in the third row.
Thank you. Thank you for the great panel. My name is Takashi Kume from Jetro, New York, originally from METI. As Senator Murkowski suggested, there would be two ways to make the export of crude oil from the U.S. possible. One is registration, the other is by administrative decision. So let's assume that there is a country which applies, which filed application to the administration by asking permission of the crude oil export. So what kind of policy consideration should be taken or should not be taken in the process of making a decision? As we know, in case of LNG, the very articulated methodology has been developed to assess the impact of the national interest. So if the government needs to articulate what would be the national interest in deciding whether or not the export of crude oil should be made. For example, if a country is NATO members or treaty allies could matter, or if a country have FTA or TPP could matter, or those issues shouldn't be considered given the nature of a global oil market, which might be different from LNG. So if you were in the government, like energy staff, as some of you used to be, what kind of consideration would you take?
Right, so we'll imagine that we're the Commerce Department advisors to
wow.
the
I'm imagining I'm the president. Forget that.
Yeah. We make the technical distinction. This is a really great question, actually, and particularly because, as you pointed out, the conversation has been pretty robust and mature when it comes to LNG and consideration of what constitutes national interest. It is, of course, different in the context of crude because of the nature of the market, because we're talking about a different set of consumers and trading relationships. So, David, do you want to take a stab at this first?
I mean, right now, the way the market works, the question wouldn't even be asked, right? That the energy markets, the oil markets don't work in the same way that the LNG markets work. But if you were to get to this, so if you were to get to this point, I mean, right now, I think thinking in the U.S. government has to do with putting trading partners in a special category, and I think as a starting point that offers one pathway along here. I think a lot of people are of the view that the trading partner issue was fine in terms of creating leverage for the U.S., both in the TPP and then in the TTIP negotiations, but it doesn't offer really the same parallel to a national security waiver that you get on some other issues, and that an approach should be more broadly articulated. I mean, my viewpoint is that the pathway forward here shouldn't be individual country winners and losers, although that is the approach that the U.S., as Senator Murkowski said, that is the approach that the U.S. has taken historically. I'm of the view that a much cleaner approach would be to articulate a pathway out and a timetable that would be, in some sense, negotiated by the administration and the Congress. But we're still sort of premature in that discussion.
Do you want to take a stab at criteria, and then I want to, yeah.
I would, if I were so fortunate to be in that situation, I guess I would present the president with three options of a sort of ascending scope to remove the ban. I will presuppose that under the national interest determination, the president has wide authority. He or she can do whatever he wants. So there's no real hoops to jump through, a box to check. You can just do what you want. The low-hanging fruit, the no-brainer, is to make a national interest finding that the free and unrestrained export of condensate is in the national interest. And at the same time, it instructs State Department to include condensate in the definition of crude oil for purposes of the prevailing Iranian sanctions. So shut down Iran's 200,000 barrel a day growing export market and replace it with 200,000 barrels a day growing of U.S. market, and then define condensate as 50 API at the coast so that you sweep in a lot of light tight oil in there as well. Then I would go down to the port, I'd have the president go down to the Houston Ship Channel and wave goodbye to the ship as it was heading to replace Iranian exports. That's the low-hanging fruit. The next one, and this is a little more risky because, you'll want to get congressional cover for all of these because of the very important pump price perception that Senator Murkowski rightly raised. The second is to deem it in the national interest that the free export of crude oil and condensate, crude oil touches on sensitivities in the pump price, so you have to have a higher bar politically, not on its merits, but to NATO and treaty allies is in the interest of the United States, and announce that in a big address, and then go to Congress and ask for Congress to affirm that, to protect yourself against the risk of a pump price increase. But the third and final thing that I would recommend that the President do, would be my personal choice, would just be to find that it is in the eminent national security interest of the United States, as well as economic interest and energy interest, to remove this artifice from the 1970s, which has no purpose, and to make it available to all countries with which we are at peace.
I'm going to, unfortunately, inject politics in this. And you have to find out, when a country comes to the administration, you have to find out, what are you talking about? Are you talking about a one-time decision? Or if you let this country, if you say yes to this country, are you going to have 50 more coming to your door with the same question? And the trade-off there is, if you have 50 more, you've got to go to people like Senator Murkowski and say, when are we going to, when do you think you can get this legislation up? Can we get this done? It would be great if we can get it done. Now I don't have to make the decision. But if I can't rely on that, I really have to think about who's going to line up after this country and what precedent I'm setting. And in that regard, I think the intersection of free trade partners and treaty allies is the logical one. If you're both, you can stand in this line. Again, I agree with my colleagues. What you want is to have the market work the way it's supposed to and the government not making these decisions. But political reality is, you can't say, hey, and I don't mean to say Senator Murkowski is wrong. She knows far more about this than I do. But if you talk to her and other people in Congress and have them say, I hope we're a couple years away, but I'm not really sure, you can't proceed as if you're going to get the best outcome. And so at that point, you need a small group of countries that you can say yes to, so you do not cause a lot of diplomatic problems by picking and choosing winners. And I think the intersection of free trade partners and treaty allies keeps this manageable if the right solution is not politically available.
So I want to drill down a little further on this. It's a conversation that exists how to choose who and how to make categories. That's happened in the LNG context, but not yet so much in the crude market, crude context. And the nature of the crude market makes this a particularly important question. So one thing that there's a little difference of opinion here is in creating categories, what would it mean? How is it beneficial, or what lines in the sand would we be drawing that we may regret or may benefit from if we choose specific categories, such as free trade partners or NATO allies? So for the crude market in particular, why would we want to use those particular categorizations or avoid them?
I just want to clarify, because I'll let my colleagues answer. I'm not advocating this as the right thing to do technically for how the market's going to work best. I'm saying if politically you don't have that option, this is the clear political winner that an administration can get congressional cooperation on.
Right. But you've raised a really good point, so yeah.
Right. Well, I would think, from a crude policy or crude market standpoint, there's no reason to categorize at all. I don't see any reason to categorize between treaty allies, free traded countries. I mean, if we were to lift the ban, the most likely destination, most likely, given the uncertainties we talked about earlier in the future oil market, would be Europe, especially Southern Europe, where there are a lot of simple refiners, the Caribbean, and Japan and South Korea, and maybe a little China eventually. And they happen to be mostly treaty allies, although Ukraine is not. Would we want to exclude Ukraine? For symbolic purposes, I wouldn't want to do that. And in the Caribbean, I'm a little fuzzy on exactly what our treaty commitments are, if they're on the same par with Japan or South Korea, but I wouldn't want to leave them out if we were doing treaties. So I see, from a crude perspective, no reason. From a trade negotiation perspective or a political perspective, i.e. it's easier to get members of the Senate and Congress to vote for or affirm a lifting if it's for treaty allies, and if as a first bite, so from a political standpoint, it may make sense to categorize, and in that case, I would think certainly treaty allies. That is something that when we think about what Russia's aggression towards Ukraine and what might come there, also China's risk in Asia, that is something that rises to the fore that Americans care about, and I can see that being able to help solve the political problem we have. So I guess only from a purely political standpoint would I think perhaps treaty allies is the strongest suit to go with, and then followed by, as I agree, trade allies.
I mean, the interesting thing will be how this plays out in the TTIP negotiations. Right. So I mean, I think that that access to LNG was one of the drivers on the TPP side. The Europeans are interested in a much more robust chapter on energy. So I think that and of course, for that if we go there, it's a little awkward because there's not a full overlap between EU members and NATO members. But I do think that the next sort of target in terms of an international process that will address this is TTIP, and I think that I mean the Europeans are extremely eager to move TTIP now, and if we can get through the TPP piece, this will come on the stage pretty rapidly.
Right. There's an interesting, of course, you mentioned the countries in Europe that you wouldn't want to leave out symbolically. This, of course, also applies for Asia. If you're thinking about TPP, which countries are not party to the conversation, but which are already and would likely be consumers of U.S. Crude and condensate export. Did you want to add something?
I was just going to add, actually, that I think in terms of sort of, picking categories that a lot, in terms of, the benefits or, the harm to the United States is going to be, and to other countries is going to be highly contextual. Like, I think it does, I mean, I can see the logic, sort of politically for saying, okay, it's just going to be, NATO members or, U.S. friends and allies, it's, politically it's appealing, sort of, it's an easy way to have a manageable category. But I think when you start looking at specific situations, it gets tricky. I mean, Bob had made the point, do you want to leave Ukraine out? And then I think, if you sort of look back in recent years and the whole sort of Iran sanctions issue and the big efforts in this country, especially after the NDAA sanctions went into effect about, how do we get China to, reduce purchases from Iran? Well, it's a lot easier to do that, if the United States could say to China that, we understand, I don't know that this would necessarily make China go down to zero, but, to be able to say, we understand your concerns about security of supply, and look, we have all this oil we can send to you. It's a lot harder to do that, in a situation where the U.S. is saying, we really want you to stop, you're the biggest buyer, but we can't sell to you. Yeah, maybe we can sell to Japan and South Korea, but not to you. So I think it's it's really going to vary by situation, and situations that may arise that in the future that we haven't planned for.
I'm being a little flip when I say another category here is those remaining importers of Iranian crude, condensate, right? In any case, so questions from the audience here in the middle of the aisle.
Hi, Michael Ratner with Congressional Research Service. Prior to the tight oil surge, say from 5 million to 9 million, there wasn't any discussion of whether or not we should lift the export ban. Even though I think most people have said, well, it was a different time and, we should have lifted it, but as I think Bob said in his opening remarks, but we didn't. It just got kind of left there. Anyway. So going forward, most of the projections show tight oil, I think prior to the recent price decline, I think EIA had it leveling off in early 2020s and potentially declining. What is, I guess, what's the panel's view of, are we going to be back here in 10 to 15 years saying, well, why did we lift the ban? Because now we're starting to import more. Because the tight oil is going away or is leveling out, our demand is up. What's the argument for saying, particularly to the consumer, that why are we lifting the ban now when in 10 to 15 years we're going to be back to where we were pre-2008?
Well, I mean, this is the thing I said about Asia as applies to the United States. You have to take your opportunities to make smart reforms. Well, you're asking the wrong panel. You should be asking a panel of senators, because they're the ones who care about the perception of bad policy 10 years from now if tight oil production drops. It's not bad policy. It's good policy. Just this is you have your opportunity to implement good policy. And then the test, which I think you're correctly getting at, which would be to make it stick. Because in 2024, in a tightly contested presidential race when gas prices are soaring, someone's going to run on banning crude oil exports. So, you know, there are no permanent political victories or defeats in Washington. One thing that you have to think about in terms of managing the market, and everyone, including in Asia, will have to think about is if the U.S. lifts the export ban, how long is it going to last?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, similar vein. I think the crude oil export ban made no sense when we were importing 60% of our oil and no one cared about it or knew about it, and it makes no sense when we're importing 26% of our oil and everyone's talking about it. And if we go back 10 years to 60%, it still makes no sense. There's no public policy benefit, I would assert, to the ban. So then the question is there a political risk of someone doing it now and then getting hammered in an election when gasoline's at $5 a barrel? The political risk is here. Senator Murkowski first mentioned it, and we've talked about it. But from a policy standpoint, I think this is just the opportunity to do so, given the boom in exports. And I would just say, EIA's projections are out there. EIA has been consistently underestimating how much light tight oil we have been able to produce. They've been revising upward and upward and upward. And we will see how quickly it goes down or how quickly shale oil comes back. We're kind of in an experiment. So again, I wouldn't want to predicate, given the uncertainties, given the revisions we've seen from EIA, the lowballing we seem to be doing still, the consensus on shale oil, and all the uncertainties of what will happen in the next 10 to 15 years, I think it's still unambiguously good policy to take this opportunity and remove the threat, the unnecessary threat to investment.
Lots of commentators talk about who agree, many of whom agree on the value in revisiting crude export policy and rolling back the export restrictions, but nevertheless hedge by suggesting that it would be important for the law and the president to be able to maintain the authority to restrict exports in extreme circumstances or when appropriate. I can't imagine why you wouldn't want to keep that in the law. Nevertheless, I struggle to think of the particular circumstance when it would actually be helpful to be able to put this in place and have the president restrict the export of crude oil from the United States. I wonder if you will engage in a thought exercise with me and speculate on when that actually might be necessary and useful.
It's a hypothetical.
It's a hypothetical.
So if China were to attack Japan or Japanese islands, and we were to rush to defend Japan, and we found ourselves in a naval, at least, conflict with China, I would think that we would be looking for every brick we could throw at China, not only interdicting their oil supplies, but also perhaps it's just a purely formal matter because I doubt anyone would export crude to China at that time. But had we liberalized it at the point, I think we'd want to prevent that, remove that. Conversely, if a country in the Caribbean was overtaken by a ruthless dictatorship that began perpetrating gross human rights violations and just shocked the international community, I would think we would want to maybe stop, and we were exporting crude to that country, I would think we'd want to stop that, if not impose a quarantine around them. So I can imagine certain hypothetical circumstances, a war or a severe crisis where a country is either not necessarily dependent hugely on the United States, but it would be part of a broader policy of quarantine, or a country that was importing a lot of U.S. oil that we would want to, for sanctions purposes, want to be able to have that authority in the president's toolkit.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, I think the authority to use it for individual countries, that has a hugely powerful rationale behind it. I think it's a little bit harder to envision the circumstances when you would want to sort of reimpose a more general ban. I think even in, I mean, if you're thinking about really extreme circumstances, so the big extreme circumstances out there is for either a cyber attack or a physical attack. The Abqaiq refining complex in Saudi Arabia goes offline, and that then you really are in a very different world. But even in that world, would the U.S. want to invoke a ban on exports, because part of what you would be trying to do was to keep the resilience of the global energy market. So it's not easy to think about a circumstance where from a policy perspective, it would make sense, but there may very well be circumstances where from a political perspective, you sort of have to do something.
Hedge in that way.
I just, I actually find in the, too much working on Capitol Hill the past couple of years, but I actually find the giving the president that authority to be useful in a perverse sort of fashion if, in fact, the president doesn't use it. In other words, that's a sign of U.S. political commitment. We reserve the right to do this, and all of our partners are looking at us, and then in one of these pseudo-crises, or actually a real crisis, we don't do it. And that's helpful because there is a political threat. There's going to be a political threat in the U.S. constantly to reimpose this ban and to interfere with exports for years to come, because we can't just shift positions and then ignore that we've had it for decades. So having the president have that authority, and especially if we have two presidents in a row who don't use it, it's actually, in a strange political way, a positive for market functioning.
Right. I think that actually it scores very well with the broader conversation in the world of coercive economic statecraft, where merely the existence of these authorities is what's particularly powerful and dissuasive for the use of energy for coercive political purposes. The SPR functions in much the same way. Its mere existence is a very, very powerful. So can I take some more questions from the audience? I'll take another one from right here.
Thank you for taking a second question. I was wondering if what your thoughts are on how lifting the oil ban would affect exports of refined products. Would it make it, would any effect at all? Would it go down? Because what if an oil company decides to shift their refining to outside of the U.S. because for might be more economical or whatever? Has there been any studies on the impact on refined products?
I'll take a first whack. Yes, there have been studies, and one would expect that if we start from the existence of the ban, which creates a distortion and a wedge between U.S. crude oil prices and international ones, that creates a rent or a subsidy, if you want, a benefit to some domestic refiners, which are able to access that cheaper feedstock. That improves their profitability. That comes on top of other improvements they've got from lower natural gas prices and other things. So what you've seen is one of the reasons why U.S. refining utilization margins, why our refineries are going gangbusters right now, and why our product exports have flipped from imports of 2+ million barrels a day to exports of 2+ million barrels a day, is because of the competitiveness of our refining sector, in part due to the ability of these refiners to access trapped oil that had been trapped due to logistic and policy reasons, and now is really just trapped due to policy reasons. So were we to remove that policy distortion, we would remove that artificial policy subsidy that had been helping those high refining margins. We would expect to see, to answer your question, the U.S. refined products to kind of come down a little bit. Our crude oil exports would go up, and then we would see some refiners who had been hurt by the policy distortion, particularly in Europe and some degree the Caribbean, would benefit from it, because then they would have access to that cheaper crude. So I think the way to look at it, though, is we start from a distortion that exists, for which we don't really have a strong public policy benefit that I'm aware of. But recognizing, to your point, I think if we were to remove it, you would expect the effects of the distortion to ebb.
How much is the Brent WTI differential driven by exactly this? And what do you think, Bob, would happen if you took this off? Would this differential go away? Or how much would it go away?
Right, so we're talking about now the difference between Brent, the global price, and WTI, the domestic price, and the difference between the two is sort of a barometer of just how trapped or how much of a distortion or a wedge is being caused. And we've seen normally the spread is sort of it's $2 or $3 with WTI just under Brent, but we've seen it go out in recent years up to $25 a barrel. Now, in the past, that was due to, again, we didn't have the pipelines to take away the oil, to move it from where it was being produced to the refining and consuming sector. So there was a logistical problem. You certainly saw it in the winter when a lot of refineries would do maintenance and the demand would go down and that backlog would build up. Since then, though, it's gone away. As I said, we've kind of removing the logistical causes of that. And what remains is just the policy one. Now, right now, partly because U.S. production is slowing because of the OPEC-driven price drop, the moment at which that backlog will build up again has been delayed, right? Most experts expect that at some point, and it'll be later now because of this 60% drop in crude oil, but at some point that 800,000 barrels a day growing light tight oil production will all sort of fall to the Gulf of Mexico and sit there and not be able to be exported, and that should lead to a widening again of that spread. And I think it was the widening of that spread, you know, a year ago plus that caused the Obama administration to recognize the problem and allow a partial easing in condensate exports. So to answer your question, Dave, it's a great one. The spread is sort of tight right now. But if we imagine the ban stays in place, we would expect it to open up eventually. And if the ban is removed, then we wouldn't get that widening, and we would just see U.S. prices and global prices much closer to each other, just reflecting quality and transportation differentials.
Just a minor point, but just coming in the general trade world. If we got into a situation, and I know it's not the most likely, and I'll defer to my colleagues who focus on global energy, if we get into a situation where the U.S. is suborning a price differential in arguably the world's most important good, it's very hard for us to make free trade arguments in that context. So, you know, if it's there for a couple months and it goes away, fine. And I don't know, I'm not characterizing this as likely. I'm just saying that situation where everyone looks and says, what are you doing with WTI being so far below Brent, and then coming us and talking to us about our price distortions here, and we knock them down. So it's another one of those, not crucial, but factors that interferes with our ability to make convincing arguments to people to liberalize, which benefits us and the world economy.
I'm going to ask one final question on Iran and then give you each a chance to offer parting wisdom to the group before we close. So on Iran, we've talked about the benefit, the strategic benefit the United States may enjoy if it puts U.S. producers in a position to compete more with in production of oil with Iran. Which there's now an increasing confidence in its re-entry into the global oil market if there should be a nuclear deal. And we've also talked about the value of signaling in being able in lifting this ban potentially, what that then says to the rest of the world on the U.S.'s interest in playing a leadership role in the global market, its commitment to free trade and expectation that other countries will follow suit. So what position will the U.S. be in strategically now in the final days of this negotiation if it makes more of its ability to export crude and signals that it would be willing to let U.S. producers do so? How can that bear on U.S. leverage, signaling, et cetera, in this last final conversation with the Iranians and then in contingency planning, essentially, for reimposition of sanctions if need be? And I'll also call out a comment I think, Erica, you made earlier saying certain countries that remain consumers of Iranian oil may be more willing to participate in those sanctions going forward, their reimposition, if politically appropriate, if they understand that the United States, others may be interested in supporting the alternative supplies necessary to keep sufficient oil in the market, though that's not an immediate concern in the current glut. Do you want to?
So I think that the president's initiative in inviting the Gulf allies to Camp David has sort of blown up in his face, and basically because that it became clear to the Gulf states that there wasn't going to be a big deliverable here. So what they were looking for and what the president was sort of signaling that he was interested in giving was a signal of strategic reassurance to the Gulf states. Now, and I think for the Gulf states, the argument that's being made, well, we can't do anything because of Israeli sensibilities and all of this, except the Gulf states and Israel are drawing closer and closer and closer in terms of their strategic outlook, and there's more and more engagement among. So I think that the main signal of something like this is we still have to find signals for strategic reassurance of the Gulf states. And I think in the absence of this larger alliance transformation signal that didn't happen, that this would be a useful thing to do. And again, it goes back to the point that when the negotiations of around the Iranian nuclear program began, it was about the Iranian nuclear program. It wasn't about a rapprochement with Iran. And I think that getting back to that is really the place where the U.S. wants to be. This can be a small step in a pathway, signaling that we aren't heading toward rapprochement.
If there's going to be a deal with Iran, I think there will be widespread concern around the world about its terms and whether we aren't de facto entering into rapprochement or basically handing over, closing down the Carter Doctrine and handing over regional hegemony to Iran. I think those concerns will exist, and that will alarm folks around the world, particularly in the Middle East, but also in Europe and Asia. But I think lifting the ban in that context, if that's what we were getting ready to do, we want to reassure folks, lifting the oil ban wouldn't really directly, I don't think, impress the Gulf monarchies who are concerned directly. But boy, would it reassure, I think, Eastern European countries, Western European countries, and Japan and South Korea that may be concerned about a broader retrenchment by the U.S. in the world. However, lifting the ban would directly, I think, reassure our very worried Gulf allies and friends, especially if it was put in the context, as you said, of a reimposition of sanctions. Here again, I want to emphasize, Iran is allowed to export condensate out the wazoo, and it's growing really fast. And I think, at the very least, by having the U.S. unbridle its condensates, you could at least compete with Iran, but you could also threaten, and I think some of the legislation earlier this year that looked at reimposing sanctions would close that loophole. And that is something certainly you'd want to do. If you were going to shut down Iranian condensate exports, you'd want to be able to go to China and Japan, which take a lot of it, and say, bad news, Iran is no longer available. Good news is you free reign to the U.S. product. So that signal, I think, a kind of a hope for the best, prepare for the worst, I think would be very helpful for both the Gulf countries directly concerned and the broader international community.
Okay, thank you. And a parting shot, anything further? Otherwise, we'll head down. Erica?
Okay, I'll
talk
incessantly. The way this reminds me of a number of other trade and investment issues, in that there's pretty clear consensus outside of the political community that unilaterally the best thing for the U.S. to do is lift the crude oil export ban. Now, we have political obstacles to that, but we're not arguing over, is this going to help the United States or hurt the United States? As a whole, it's going to help the United States. And to me, the real policy choice is, do we game this? Are we strategic about it? In other words, do we, instead of just saying, hey, let's unilaterally do this, do we try to trade it? And I think, we have a lot of things to talk about. I think the important thing to get out there right now is this is the best thing for the U.S. by itself. I do think, from a policy perspective, I would want to think about, what can we trade this for? Maybe we can't. Maybe it just doesn't work that way, and we should just take the unilateral action. That might be something where you get some non-political pushback. There's a strategic element of this that, even though it's the best thing for the U.S. to do, we might get more if we don't just step forward into this gap.
And that's the TTIP argument.
Right.
Right. Well, great, thank you. This has been a really unique conversation, and I think an important contribution to the broader conversation about crude export. Please join me in thanking our panelists today with a round of applause, which will end our event.